want to welcome students, friends, and colleagues. I want to begin the proceedings by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land on which I am presenting, the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nations. And I pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and those emerging, and to all Indigenous and Torres Strait Islanders who are witnessing this presentation this evening. I am Professor Donald Bates. I'm the Chair of Architectural Design at the Melbourne School of Design and Associate Dean for Engagement within the Faculty of Architecture, Building and Planning at the University of Melbourne. MSD at Home is our online lecture and event series from the faculty. Melbourne Speaks is the opportunity for our senior academic faculty to address the wider public with an insight into their research, their academic and professional interests, and to make these significant issues part of our intellectual and social engagement. It is very much my great pleasure for this session of MSD at Home, Melbourne Speaks, to introduce Professor Sheng Han, Professor of Urban Planning at the Faculty of Architecture, Building and Planning. Professor Sheng Han's research and teaching expertise are in the areas of urban and regional development, strategic planning, and analytical methods in urban studies. He joined the University of Melbourne in 2007. Previously, Professor Han was a tenured associate professor at the National University of Singapore. In his career, he's also practiced urban planning in the China Academy of Urban Planning and Design in Beijing, and has taught at Simon Fraser University and the University of British Columbia in Vancouver. Professor Han has also worked in the United Nations Center for Regional Development in Nagoya in Japan. Professor Han is a member of the Transport, Health, and Urban Design Research Lab at the Melbourne School of Design. Professor Han has been working on a research agenda which links theories of the spatial organization of urban activities with the dynamics of institutional and economic restructuring in the Pacific Asia region. He has been active in pursuing his research agenda and successful in fundraising, graduate student supervision, research, collaboration, and publications. For his lecture tonight, Professor Han will speak to, quote, lessons from a controversial urban mobility innovation. What has Dockless bike sharing taught planning researchers and practitioners? So I would like to welcome for this evening's MSD at Home Melbourne Speaks, Professor Sheng Han. Professor.
Thank you very much, Professor Bates, for your kind introduction. Hello, everybody. Welcome to this presentation. I would like to start my presentation by also acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which I'm making this presentation. And I would like to pay my respect to the elders, past, present, and the emerging, and also extend my respect to those other Indigenous Australians who are in the session. Let me share my slides. So tonight, the focus of my presentation is on urban mobility. In particular, I'm talking about these Dockless bike sharing schemes. And these are the bikes that appeared in Melbourne streets some time ago in the year 2017 and closed in the year 2018. These are the bikes that do not use a station, and you can start your trip using that bike from any location, so as long as you can find such a bike, and also to end your trip at any locations that you like. It's supposed to be a advantage of using these bikes with that sort of flexibilities. And the background picture of this covering page, a few of these shared bikes. In in a location near the Parkwell campus of the University of Melbourne. They came unsure to Australian cities, include Melbourne, and they disappeared not long after they started their operation. So basically my presentation talk about the understanding of this quick come and quick disappearance of this bike in Melbourne and all other cities, try to ask within a bigger picture, how do we understand and explain those operations? I would divide my presentation into 3 parts, and I will give the introduction talking about the background and my research questions, and also present a conceptual brief about the program that I designed for myself to look into and also to work with my team members. And then I moved to the second section, talking about the growth and decline of these bike sharing schemes. I was focusing on the different phases of this both boom and bust of the programs, and also looking to those stakeholders behind the processes and products. In the third section, I'm going to try to draw some lessons from the experience of these Dockless bike sharing programs, and particularly focusing on 2 bodies of knowledge. One is around the literature about co-production of urban services. The other one is around the innovation diffusion theory. And from these discussions, I try to draw some conclusion which connect to the practice, creative planning, and the design in particular. So this topic about urban mobility innovations has been one of my research focus in my career, and I spent quite some time doing research in the area of sustainable transport planning and development, then moved on to the study of low carbon cities, focusing on these different spatial structure of cities and how this transportation arrangement may lead to different levels of carbon emission. And from there, I developed a little bit further in this area, focusing on bicycles. That's with some industrial grant supports. And the conclusion of that project on the bicycle studies, then it was the year 2016 when the Dockless bike sharing program emerged and developed very fast. That really fascinated me, and I kept an eye on it and did a few projects on it. So today what I'm talking about is a part of that effort. So the Dockless bike sharing program is about, well, it included a different range of programs. Some of them started from different origins. We know that in the 1960s, there was the first generation of shared bikes emerged on the street of Amsterdam. So there is a so-called Dutch white bikes that was recognized as the first generation Dockless bike sharing programs. And during the early 20th century in Germany, there are some programs also introduced to have stationless or dockless bike sharing programs. But in terms of technology use, then the modern Dockless bike sharing programs include more of these advanced technologies, things like global positioning system, the GPS, the geographical information processing systems, and also the smartphone. And using all these new devices and technology, this modern Dockless bike sharing program started in about 2015. That's very much a year when some of the prototype bikes were developed and some of the earlier programs started. And then it diffused or spread, especially to a number of cities. Many of these cities, whether it is in Europe or in America, in Australia, New Zealand, then have these programs operating in selected cities. Here on the screen, I present a few pictures captured in Sydney. Then that's a few bikes from the Mobike program. It started a few years ago, and its operation continued, which is one of the rare cases when the Dockless bikes after closing didn't totally disappear from the street. Similar bikes of different color that comes from a different program also find in Singapore. That's one from the Orchard Road, which is one of the busiest shopping streets in Singapore. And here is a old bike found in Rome. And that's the same type of bike appeared on the Melbourne streets and also disappeared quite fast. So in terms of the number of these Dockless bike sharing programs, there are lots of bikes come from China, then shipped from Beijing or Shanghai, operating in the various cities of different countries. But that's not the only country supplying all these bikes. Like old bike, that's the one again appeared in the Melbourne street, that came from Singapore, a company registered in Singapore, and that company also operated their bikes in, as they claimed, about 24 countries all over the world. So because they come in the 2017s and disappear in about a year or so, then that left a very big footprint to the environment. Here are two pictures showing that after the declining process of the Dockless bike sharing programs, then there are so-called bike graveyards appeared in a number of cities where you can find the piling up of these Dockless bikes, and it is not used anymore, but wasted in one way or another in these places. That caused a lot of concerns in terms of the resource waste and also in terms of environment pollution. So questions can be asked about what happened behind all these bike sharing systems. How can we explain the very rapid growth and also the very rapid decline of these bike programs? And more importantly, we probably face, as planners, as planning researchers, facing similar situations in future when new urban mobility innovations come and go. Then what is Dockless bike sharing can offer to us? What lessons we can draw to improve our design and management capabilities? These are the broad questions that I ask myself, my colleagues, and the members in my research team, and we try to work on this with some sort of answers. So here is a brief conceptual framework to work on this topic. There are a few assumptions. One is that urban mobility innovation is a continuous process, and this process includes some of these positive impacts and also some of these negative impacts. The process keeps on going. Over time, it generates lots of different interventions, try to keep all these positive aspects and also improve these negative aspects. And these innovations also not stand-alone processes or products. They interact with each other. When we talk about urban mobility, for example, bicycle is one of the modes of transport, but there are lots of other micro-mode transportation means, like electronic scooters. So things like that go parallel and competing the road resources with each other. And also each of these innovations are linked with other economic sectors. For example, we can think about manufacturing sector for the bicycles. When there is a boom of bike supply, then there is a boom of job opportunities and also the production from these sectors. So we look at these innovations not as a standalone thing, but rather as a part of a broad range of activities and processes. And the third assumption is that these urban mobility innovations are not fixed in one city or one country, but they spread over space, over time, to different places. And the spread pattern itself is interesting. And later on, as you see from one of the slides, I will also explain this spatial differences itself is also a strategy that some of these companies take consideration of these differences and drive their business model and process to their success, to achieve their goals. And it's also important to understand what's behind all these spread when we're talking about special patterns or the processes. And in particular, I think these stakeholders, those policies and institutions, as well as technology and the infrastructure available for that particular innovation are important. So putting all these three assumptions together, I think a study on this urban mobility innovation focusing on the bike sharing programs offer the potential to advance scholarship and also to contribute, improve the creativity in design and management practices. So this study will include not only a particular country. We are not talking about why all bikes disappeared or came to Melbourne, but rather we put these operations as a part of the whole picture. Is rather a global picture to see all these players and also the different patterns as unfolding in the process. So with that background, I move on to this second section, take a look of the different phases and also the main players behind all these schemes. In the bicycle sharing literature, basically we see a lot of discussions of the different generations of shared bikes. It started from mid-1960s, the first generation came. That's the white bikes in Amsterdam. And then moved on second generation, third generation, and now we are in the fourth generation in terms of the technological use and also in terms of the use of stations. Now, this modern Dockless bike sharing is very much the latest improvement or innovation in the bike sharing series. These programs came from, well, basically from 2015 by some young entrepreneurs, very brave to take the risk and try different models, try different ways of financing their programs and try to make a success of their business. One of these pioneers, I presented two on the screen. One of the pioneers came from universities led by a few of these young university students. They started to try this high end of customized bike tour, but use the name of OFO, that's OFO bike. So starting from there, not very successful, and then they give a very hard thinking about what will be other opportunities for this group of young people to make a success in their business venture. They stationed in Peking University and observed the large number of bicycle users and also understand the problems faced by those students in finding their bikes and in maintaining their bikes. So the idea of bike sharing came. And they organized their company, collected about 2,000 bikes from the beginning, then use the alumni network, some of these venture capitalists to support them. then their business quickly succeeded in a sense of accepted by many students and also expanded to a number of universities in a number of cities all over China. They used quite a simple technology. That's the combination locks. It's not that high tech at that time. Later on, they changed. That change was very, very much some sort of learning from other competitors. And one of these other competitors, which is also taken as one of the top two pioneers, is the Mobike program. And this Mobike started from a different kind of storyline, started from a night coffee meeting. And that coffee meeting with the original purpose that this finder of the Mobike tried to bring a bike designer to a potential investor. So by making connection, the hope was to develop a new business. That effort wasn't successful in that particular night, but this lady, the founder of Mobike, was fascinated by the idea of Mobike, which is basically, according to their discussions, is a combination between mobile and bike, so Mobike. And the idea is to use the technologies like GPS, GIS, and smartphone, and also design a new type of bikes. This will be different in looking, very stylish, and use that as the basic product for bike sharing programs. So they in this particular Mobike case, then the founder got support from the capitalist from that night meeting, and then started her design with a group of friends. These people are usually very well connected. So they started the design of the prototypes. They set up their own manufacturing plant, and they created the first batch of bike and launched in April 2016. That's very, very much a starting point of this bike. And from there, they try to continue the innovation and expand their market and try to be the industry number one. And this industry number one seems, from the very beginning of these pioneers, the ultimate goal of their business. So this sort of intention or ambition has been expressed in various occasions in the operation of the business. On the screen, there's one of the examples when they exchanged messages between the top two pioneers on the occasion of Mobike's first anniversary. So running to the end of the first year, Ofo sent a greeting to Mobike, say, "Hey mate, happy birthday. Thanks for the opportunity to grow together with us in the past year. We were so lonely without you before that." Obviously, the message behind is that we are the leader and you are the follower. And the Mobike also replied in the same way, say, "Hey dude, thanks for the greeting, but we are very happy that you are actually following us because of the technology you learned from us, and also you learned from us moving from the university campus to the citywide operations." So with all that sort of ambition and attitude, that drive all their business expansions. When we talk about why these bikes in Melbourne, why in European cities or in American cities, and this is an important part to understand how businesses spread. So this table shows some of these selected cities in the expansion process, starting from June 2016 with the first launch of Mobike in April 2016, and up to the mid of 2018, then within about less than 2.5 years, these programs claimed that they have operations in almost or more than 200 cities. Mobike, for example, within a few months, they have operations in all the big cities in China. And they continue to expand occupied many of these second, third tier cities and reached the number domestically that's within the China market, not including all these expansions to the overseas market, with 176 cities in operation of their bikes by July 2018. OFO had a similar trajectory. It launched later because the early focus was on university campus. It was only in November 2016 then they moved out from the campus to the citywide operations. And within about 2 months, then they spread their operations to over 50 cities in China. And within another 6 months, they claimed that they had 100 cities in operation, also within that China market. And by the same time, when Mobike reached 176, then OFO had 250 cities in operation. That's very, very big number. And also at the same time, they're expanding to Asian cities, to European cities, to American cities, to Australia, New Zealand, all the way to the different corner of the world. And during that competition process, also we observed that there are other bike sharing systems joined this competition or operations. Hello Bike is relatively a big one among these other bike sharing programs. It took a very different strategy and selected different cities. We talk about that later on. But it also reached a very big number in terms of the places it operates. O-Bike didn't export to overseas market outside China. Some of these smaller programs joined, but many of them survived for a very short period of time. Basically, the capital of these investors are very careful about where do they put in their support. So overall, the first two phases basically reflect the fast growth of bike sharing programs. They're starting from the conception of this Mobike and OFO up to the launch of Mobike in April 2016. That's roughly the first phase. And then from the launch of this Mobike in 2016 to the date when the very first Mobike program was bankrupted, that marked the second phase of growth. Now, up to that point, then the program, in terms of number of cities, in terms of the number of bikes in the fleets, continued to increase. But that is an important time, that's in June 2017, when the third phase started. And this third phase observed some of this inertia of these programs to grow continuously for another 5 or 6 months. But very soon it was found that both of these pioneers of the Dockless bike sharing programs ran out of funds, basically. They had difficulties to get new supporters to put in their venture capital with them. And there were rumors at that time that these two bikes, as the largest ones, should merge. It didn't work out. The closed door negotiations led to the sellout of Mobike to another big company, which is called Meituan. Meituan is a company focusing on food delivery. And Meituan thought, well, by acquiring Mobike, it could extend its business capabilities, particularly when looking at the big data collected by these Mobikes. Then the OFO CEO was declared in the status of legally in debt. He was restricted actually in spending or limited by against taking airplanes. He couldn't fly because he basically owns money. And these money are from the deposit, security deposit from the users. So that very much marked the end of the boom period. That's the decline and bust period of the Dockless bike sharing. Now, what are those stakeholders, are the players behind all these processes and products of these drastic changes? On the screen, I put about 6 groups of people. One is the startup entrepreneurs. The other one is venture capitalists, government and users, that forms another two, and saboteurs of these programs, as well as the vigilantes also played very important role for the unfolding of this expansion and contraction of these programs. Let's take a quick look of these different players. The startup entrepreneurs are those young people with great ambitions about business success. They are willing to take risks, and they are experienced. And before setting up these bike sharing programs, they had experiences in many of them just closely related fields, car rental, for example, or reporting of these automobile businesses, or co-founder of something, other bike programs. And these are the people very keen to be successful in the business, and successful particularly measured in terms of the scale of their business and in terms of the spread of their business to different corners of the world. The other group of the people are the venture capitalists. These are the people with very strong financial resources. And they sit in their offices through different networks, talking with those people, looking for money, looking for support for their businesses. Once they find opportunities, they put in their capital and try to make a business out from it. It's a very good thing in terms of the development of new startups. And these people are also very, very ambitious, because they know the risk is very high with these startup companies. So they are very keen also to cash out whenever the business value reach the expectation level. Then they stop playing in that business, then they cash out. And they have their own offices, and also they have some shared places, shared spaces also emerging in a way. For example, this innovation pathway can be read in that way. It's not to break the world into three. These are the places that people aggressively are looking for potential partners. These are two very important groups, and these two groups are linked together, supporting each other. And these support are reflected in the various rounds of investment. Mobike got its series of rounds of investment. Each rounds can contribute about 100 million US dollars. We don't know the exact number, but from the report, they give this 100 million or 600 million US dollars from each of these rounds. That's big budget, big capital. And when we think about each fleet has about 100,000 bikes operating in Shanghai or operating in other cities, then these are the capital behind to support all these growth and expansions. Very similarly, O4 has that support, had various rounds, and all these rounds of capital also came in kind of cycles. Then they're competing with each other. When O4 announced, I got this round C financing, got about a few $100 million very quickly next week, probably, or if not next day, you will hear from Mobike that they got a very large chunk of capital also coming in. And so the idea is to build up all these business attractions. And it's somehow similar in terms of the collaboration between the operators and investors. It's similar with a soccer game. When you see these forwards, then get support from midfielders, and they work together to score. Another group of these players are the government and users. Government is a very complex group of actors there. It's not just one single player, because there are different tiers of government. Like, for example, in the Chinese situation, if we simplify the diagram a bit, then there are central level government, provincial level government, there are local level governments. And within each of governments, of course, there are sectorial agencies, there are ministries, commissions, there are bureaucracies, that there are departments, committees, and all these different parts of the government are not necessarily act concertedly over things. There might be delays in terms of policies supporting something or stopping something. There might be a period of time that some agencies working to facilitate a certain process, other agencies may be not there to support, even using some outdated regulations or policies and try to put a stop on these things. So in general, over these different phases, we see the different rules of government. At the very beginning, government is important, but rather as a background supporters. And gradually in phase 2, then more of these interventions were observed, particularly in terms of the associations, like bicycle associations set up standards for the industry, and regulations about this vandalism, or in terms of minimum age of people who can use the bike. And in the third stage, also a lot of more of these local regulations were introduced in the effort to control the fleet size or some of these performance evaluation related ideas. The users, again, also are not one group of people. These users are important in the production of the Dockless bike sharing programs because they pay a security deposit. And without strict financial regulations, these were accounted, especially in the early stage of the program development. They were counted as part of the money which can be used for reproduction of the programs. And also within these broad users, they all by paying this security deposit are coerced into the program development. And within this group, then we see the regular users. This is a large majority of the people who try to benefit, resolve their commuting problems, particularly the last mile problem. And also you see a small group from time to time appear as users, but they are doing criminal activities. And these include, for example, they decode some of these combination code, combination lock codes and try to sell for a profit. And some of these may put a fake QR code, just cover up this original. So once people scan that code, then that person will be directed to a different website. And that will further lead to some sort of criminal activities. It's more financial related scandal things. In the third stage, then the herd withdrawal for their deposit. Users try to get their security deposit back because they saw some of these companies are closing business. And that's scary because I put a few $100s there, so I want to take it back. This large crowd of people try to get their money back, really put a very strong pressure for many of these operators, these entrepreneurs. And many of them closed because they cannot repay the users. So in one way or another, the users becomes a very critical part in the success or the closure of these programs. Then the other group is the saboteurs. And this other group of people try to put a check on the bike sharing programs. The pictures that show on the screen probably is quite familiar to many of you. And these sort of things were observed in various cities. So of course, it's not unfamiliar to people in Melbourne. The old bikes were found in the Yarra River, for example. Once there was an occasion, over 120 old bikes were fished out from the Yarra River. And some of these old bikes were also put on the roofs or on top of the trees. So these things are happening, take away from the public space, take away from the users. And there are other group of people try to hide these bikes, use a chain lock to lock it just for personal use. So use my channel because you wouldn't be able to open it. So that would be dedicated for my personal use. And that's another saboteur. And also there are some business operators, especially the black taxi operators. In some of the cities, black taxi services were available because people rarely commute a long distance from the last stop of the public transport to their residence. And that created the need to resolve this last mile problem. So black taxis come in. But once this bike sharing program introduced to these cities, then these black taxi operators very quickly find they lost their business. So they hate these bikes and they throw away these bikes, pile up these bikes on the streets or in random locations. And this created another reason for another group of people, which are the urban management squad, which is basically a government agency, try to maintain the order of the street. They removed these bikes piled up by others, probably, to some selected locations very often. That's the bike graveyards. And sometimes they remove these bikes from this cluttered, not necessarily piled up in an ugly way, but it's just cluttered and on the pedestrian walk. So made no space for other street users. So they move all these things over to different locations. And this group of people, saboteurs, I group them into three categories. One is the good saboteurs. The other one is the bad saboteurs. And the third one is the ugly saboteurs. The good one basically has a good intention. They remove your bikes because they want to order the operation. So in the long run or even mid run, then it will benefit the business. Although in the short run, you need to pay a fine to collect back your bikes. The bad saboteurs are those people try to keep the bikes for themselves. In the middle of this screen, the photo shows that that woman changed that 04 bike, that's the yellow bike. She repainted part of the bike with black, and also she restructured the bike a little bit, customized for her own use. Apparently there is a seat for a toddler. So that's another group of people try to personalize this bike, take away from the public and make it for their own use. The ugly part, this group of people are very aggressive, try to hurt people. They may put some needles, for example, on the seat, and it creates a fear among the population, the users in particular, in touching the Dockless bike share bikes. And so these are the problem groups, I would say, that try to stop the fast growth of the Dockless bikes. The last group I want to highlight is the group called vigilantes. And these are the group determined to make a difference and help those innovations to continue operation to benefit their users. One of these group of people call themselves bike hunters. They are not hunting for animals, but hunting for bikes. They look for bikes, hide by individuals, locked by individuals, try to bring this bike back to the public space. They are so dedicated, they even have their own toolkit with a very strong wrench to cut the chains that if that was applied to the bike. And also they have this inflator or markers to do minor repairs. So it's really try to help these bikes to function as they're supposed to. In Shanghai, there is an organization registered as hunters. It's just a free organization, volunteers in that group, but it reached a number of 2,000 over the country in various cities. And also that organization seemed very well organized into 3 different layers of organization. And also they give different kind of titles for people participating in this process, different levels of hunters. That's a group of people, the vigilantes. And then there are a group of students participate in these activities to protect these bikes. So there is a picture showing that these could be high school students or these university students select a particular day in a week and then go on the street, look for these unorderly parked or those bikes fall on the ground, try to place them in proper boxes or places. Another group of people are those individuals. They don't join organizations, but whenever they have time, they will help to find the bikes and also to make the bikes orderly and ready for use. So basically, these are the people behind the bike sharing programs, and very much we see that this is a program that involves various players, various stakeholders. There is not simply provided by the government or by a business, but it involves different walks of life in that process of its development and decline. Now I move on to section number 3, thinking about what sort of lessons we can draw from this boom and bust of the Dockless bike sharing programs, and how this knowledge probably can inform the further innovation of planning and design. My discussion will be around these two bodies of literature. The first one is co-production of the basic urban services. Here, the co-production of basic urban services, focusing on the services of things like policing, medical care, those education, water supply, electricity supply, or the solid waste collection. You can name quite a few of them, and usually these are the very basic functions that cities need, and residents in cities will have a hard time without these services, and these services are generally provided by the government. So the co-production literature started to grow during the 1970s. There was mainly a response to the problems by the government-dominated service model. So the government-dominated service model concentrate on the public financing of these programs. The problem is the demand of these services are always increasing, but the public finance had difficulties to keep pace with all these demand increases. The result is that the service is inadequate. And over time, it's always in a situation that service demand is increasing, then the money to supply these things are not enough. And this led to the other idea about providing these services through different means, including users, and doing a co-production, not only centered on the government, but also using users as a very important resource input. So basically, there is an orthodox co-production model focusing on the government and users' collaboration as the core, as an alternative to the single government-dominated supply models. And in this model, then there are many examples, including citizens, including technology, including policy, then to improve the situation of urban basic service provision. Then in a study of all these possible examples, there was a finding that there is a possibility to have models which are not necessarily centered on the collaboration between government and users. This is particularly true in many of these developing countries, where the government actually collaborated with business owners instead of the users. And these are different things, users and business owners. And by this collaboration, it also generates these needed services, and particularly in terms of this urban mobility service. One example is in Ghana. there is an urban transport union, which basically consists of these small business owners, those people operating bus services, not big scales, small ones, they have a lot. So the employees, the owners are the members of the union. There are incentives for the government to collaborate with this union because the government can mobilize the voters in political elections. And also it is possible to collect tax in certain forms by using the union as a way to organize all these small business owners. Business owners also has the incentive to collaborate with the government because the operations is very much subject to many of these regulations and policing. And government protection will avoid many of these situations where they could be fined somehow. So that's an unorthodox type of model of supplying these basic urban services. Now, the Dockless bike sharing system basically provides a different model. And in this model, it's not the government in the center of this operation, but rather the entrepreneurs and the venture capital. Their collaboration becomes the core of this service provision. And within this structure, government and users are still important, but they are not the central planners. Citizens, technology, and policy are also important. I think basically the Dockless bike sharing programs make a contribution in terms of the different governance structure offered by the co-production literature. And on top of that, it also increase or deepen the understanding of these various participants in the process. On the screen, these are the general participants mentioned by many of these researchers published in the bike sharing programs. They mention this, but with very limited understanding into the dynamics within each groups. And this research on the Dockless bike sharing basically filling that gap and get the understanding deeper in that sense. The other body of literature that the Dockless bike sharing studies can contribute is on the innovation diffusion. Innovation diffusion is emphasizing on the spread of these new ideas and products from one place to another. The traditional studies in the classic innovation theory, users were focused. And those people adapt those innovations first, second, or third in terms of time or groups are studied. And the behavior of these people and also attributes of these people are studied. So that contribute to an understanding of innovation diffusion. You can understand these studies have a spatial dimension, but the spatial dimension is not the focus there. They wouldn't explain why this city accepted that faster than the other city. So there are part explanations, not totally none, but it's not their focus in the explanations. In economic geography or in the economic geography or in the geographical study of spatial diffusion of innovations, the focus are also on the hosting side, the cities themselves. So the models focus on, for example, whether the condition of that particular city is favorable or not to the innovations, and that lead to the adaptation process or adaptation processes. And also in terms of the linkages between the cities, there is relational type of geography among these cities. For example, some cities may have sister relationships between each other. And these relationships can serve as channels to shift one idea from a place to another. So that also focusing on the hosting side, but there is no focus or understanding on the pushing side of this innovation diffusion. And what we observe from the Dockless bike sharing program, they're spreading over the spaces are very strong pushing forces behind, coming from that alliance from the investors and the entrepreneurs. So this is a new part, contribute to the body of knowledge. And also, this study shows that the spatial outcome is not only an outcome, but also feedback into the process. Feedback in a sense that it is itself a spatial distribution of these bikes itself is a strategy for these firms to navigate through the different landscape towards success. So HelloBike provide an example. They didn't start with these large cities where the top two programs competed heavily. So they didn't join that competition in these cities, but rather they find relatively smaller cities. The media report exaggerated it a little bit on this, and they reported from the countryside to cities strategy adopted by the HelloBikes. And they connected this strategy with the revolutionary strategy led by Chairman Mao Zedong during this communist revolution period, occupy the countryside first and then come back to cities. There are some similarities, but the study shows that the cities are basically the focus in this spread of the bikes, but they did emphasize on the lower tier of cities. If we see a hierarchy of these cities, larger ones to smaller ones, they did focus these smaller ones as opposite to the strategies taken by OFO or Mobike, starting from the larger cities. So this learning can feed back to the innovative management and design practices. One thing is the entry control. They can study the capacity of the city and also the performance of these bikes in that particular city, link this together and evaluate, negotiate for a size of the program to operate in the city. And also there are some policy innovations can be developed from the further understanding of these programs. Policies, for example, to control the use of security deposit, or regulations about the minimum age of these users to avoid the risks, especially related to children's use. Infrastructure planning is another area because the dedicated bike lanes or those nodes of traffic, including pedestrians, public transport, maybe private cars, and also bicycles, and then the design of these spaces becomes an important undertaking and need innovations and need this knowledge to inform all these creations. The last part is that the participatory management, and this is something new to involve different sectors in the management of the street order of these bikes, for example. One of the very recent innovation is to involve the government sectors and also to involve the businesses, using regulations to say, hey, you have to tell your users to behave like this. And also to include those shop owners with the frontage on the street. They can give a shout out sometimes and say, hey, you guys got to place the bike into the box or somewhere in orderly order. And also these people working on the street as cleaners. And all these participation and possibly bring a different results that get things organized. So these are particular explorations going on in cities with that Dockless bike sharing operations. Now, this is one of the picture I took very late last year before we were grounded by all these pandemic restrictions. Basically, the dynamics of the Dockless bike sharing programs are reflected in the color palette of the bikes. And those offer the very fresh, bright yellow has gone almost. You see occasionally some of them scattered here and there, but in large numbers, no more. And there are new bikes coming in. The Meituan bike then is one, try to replace the Mobike. And then there is a HelloBike, which takes a large number in many of these cities. And also there is a new bike called Qingju bike. In terms of the operation model, there is still a problem in terms of the success of this normal business rental. So if you rely upon this rental income to maintain the business is not there yet. That means these bikes wouldn't survive if they rely on this normal business model. There are still speculations of the value adding of these bikes, particularly their potential value to add to the businesses, the bigger businesses. But this speculation is fundamentally different from the situation when the venture capitalists were involved. So for the future, when we think about whether this bike sharing program will continue, is very much depend on how successful these bikes can bring back all these expected value adding values. That's the use of big data to facilitate DD, for example, the Uber equivalent in China, all these food delivery businesses or other online businesses. If that big data can be made use of and increase value, there are pretty much a hope of the continuous growth of this. I wrap up here. Just show you two references. Many of these details I didn't mention or expand here in the references. Thank you very much. I stop here for the presentation. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, Sheng. That was really fantastic, and really, I found it really fascinating in terms of some of the background. It's funny because, you know, here in Melbourne, we saw these different systems just suddenly appear out of almost nowhere, and then fairly rapidly also disappear, but I didn't really have the kind of background of and the context of that. So it's really fascinating to hear, and I'm sure there'll be a number of questions that come out of that. But before I take some of the questions, again, for those of you who are in the audience, please feel free to send any questions through the Q&A function, and we'll try to get to as many as we can in the time that's remaining. I just wanted to ask a little bit, just as a kind of preface in a way to your talk as well, if you could say anything about the relationship between the bike sharing systems that did use a dock versus the the dockless bike sharing systems. I mean, in the sense of, are they sort of extensions of one another, or are they in fact, to a certain degree, completely different in the mode of operation, in terms of their financing, in terms of, particularly when you talked about at the end, this notion of the sort of participants of whether it's government-led or whether it's business and government, or it's entrepreneurs and venture capitalists and such. Could you say a little bit about the difference between the docking and the non-docking system?
Sure, yeah. Thanks, Don, about that question. That's a very important, fundamental question, I think, when we understand these shared bikes. There are lots of similarities between these dockless shared bikes and the docked shared bikes. The main service is to provide a bicycle, a rental bicycle for the population. And many of these people come as tourists, but also lots of residents use the services. There are similarities in terms of that bicycle rental, but in terms of the user population, then we probably see many of these local people use the dockless bikes as compared with the docked bikes. That's not to say that local people does not use the docked bikes, but dockless bikes tried to fix that last mile service issue, and many of these local residents took the opportunities to ride the last mile. And also in terms of technology, there are quite a bit difference. This is the latest generation of shared bikes. So we're talking about both dockless as shared bikes, but these dockless bikes use more of these modern technologies, especially the GPS or GIS and smartphone as part of it. So technologically, it's differently configured as compared with the docked ones. There are probably other differences also.
Well, I would assume, you know, because I know in Melbourne, when the first sort of docked bikes, bike share came out, it was very much a kind of relationship between the city of Melbourne and an advertising company. And there was a kind of linkage of, to a certain degree, providing a public service, but under the assumption that there would be further dividends, much less the, as you said, the kind of rental and such of it.
Yes.
I'm curious relative, because when the O-Bike came to Melbourne, it just kind of appeared. So I'm curious, is there an approvals process before, or in some senses, do these bikes just appear and it's sort of assumed that whoever's providing it is taking all of the risk in terms of the cost of providing it versus what it might be?
That's right. That's a very, very interesting question. And also it was inquired by many researchers how these aggressive entrepreneurs actually operate the bike. Indeed, they need entry permit in many of the places, particularly in the overseas market. But in the Chinese market, they do need permit also, but they operated in a way that they shipped a box, a container box of these bikes to the city. And next morning, you see all over the places there are bikes without that permit. And then in the second day, suddenly they find there is a fine notice to some of these operators say, you had bikes illegally used in this city, you have to pull out. So they got to organize a negotiation in order to continue. Some of these are successful. So after the first attempt without a permit, but some of them ended up miserably. They were reluctant to be accepted by the city. Suzhou, I think, was one of these examples. The city had a very good docked bike sharing system, and you thought, well, it would be very messy to start this dockless bike sharing programs. So they said, nope, we don't need you. So they shipped very quickly to another city, started another try. They succeeded in that. Usually more strict when coming back to Melbourne or to any other cities in American cities, for example. We heard reports that from the early contact and negotiation for entry, that many of these bike companies didn't really get the permit, so they have to shift it to other places.
I'm going to ask just one more of my questions, because there's actually quite a number of questions coming in from the audience. I just want to cover, I mean, it's funny when you started talking, you know, from my point of view, at first I thought, well, this is just the convenience of having a bike, take you from point A to point B. If it's docked, you have to go back to the dock, so it might not be as convenient. But in general, it's that. But then I started to think about it, and I thought, well, actually, this is more than just the momentary convenience. It's a long-term convenience. You don't have to store the bike in your house. You don't have to take care of it. You don't have to buy it, you know, so there are a number of these. But then you mentioned this notion of collection of data, and that got me interested also, because we know services like Uber, in some ways, they're more interested in the data they collect than the sort of cash revenue. They operate at a huge loss for years and years, but the collection of data is very important for them. And I'm curious if this was underwriting a number of these schemes that you've referred to.
This basically is a very important element in the initial design of the dockless bike systems. It's expected that the data collected will service many of these companies, even they can sell off the data as a part of their revenue income. So with that GPS system, they have a complete activity pattern as described by the users. By having this big data capability, then it gives the programs an advantage to contribute to related businesses, the delivery businesses in particular. And they even talking about the public sector, like the planning agencies. If you want to see where are those peak may happen in certain hours, then the bike data will give you all these indications. So it was in that, that plan, but my understanding is not yet fully realized in terms of the potential of this possibility. There are data analyzed, but we don't see many applications yet. There are experiments still in the level, I would say. There are differences also among these these programs, like larger ones versus smaller ones. Smaller ones are generally less competitive in generation of this data, and this add up to the disadvantage they are experiencing, together with the financing issues, and lead to the difficulties for them to struggle and close their businesses.
I'm going to just read some of these questions for you. The first one it's two parts, in fact. It says, does the urban density matter for a city to use dockless bike systems to meet its last mile commuting needs? Or in other words, does urban density matter regarding the dockless bike system's operation and survival? And does the urban size matter? Does the dockless bike system reshape a city with different population sizes in different ways, whether it's a small or a large city in some form?
Yeah, thanks very much. These are very, very good questions. I think for the first part of the question, in terms of density, it is very important in a way that density determines the ridership. And ridership is a basic parameter in calculation of the revenues. So with adequate ridership, then there will be adequate data also generated from that business. So the density is one of the major considerations when the place was selected to operate these bikes. The second part of the question, in terms of the different structure or the size of cities, these are also play very important roles. These two parts of the questions, I think, is somehow interconnected. When you have high densities, usually these are in larger cities. And when it's in smaller cities, then usually the density is low. But these smaller cities and larger cities offer different business opportunities. That means the fleet size may be different. When you got large fleet size, that means there will be a big opportunity or big chance for people to find a bike once you step out of your door. But if you have smaller size, the situation will be different. And so that provides the base for some companies to look for these smaller places to start their business, because the bigger companies will look at these high density, larger places. So yes, there is a difference.
I'm just going to extrapolate on that a little bit. Do you think that the companies did any research to understand what's a kind of minimum number for a certain density, or was it just really trial and error? They just put out as many as they could and see what happened?
Very, very interesting question. Thanks for reminding me about that. They didn't do any systematic study. That's my understanding. But they do have some intuitive understanding of these places. Some of these companies send their CEOs to the city and basically to tick a few of their criteria in terms of topography, in terms of population density, in terms of the current services and the population attitude toward bicycles. And those are all these considerations. It's not coming from a systematic feasibility study. They didn't have time for that. They just get this bike fresh, hot from the manufacturer and very quickly shift to these particular cities they are targeting. And then they start their operations. But they didn't have time to really study that beforehand.
Yeah. There's a question here. It says, Dear Mr. Han, many thanks for your insightful presentation. In regards to various different models of bike sharing scheme implementation, that is by government, by PPPs, by private entities, that you have seen in your experiences, what is the model that is most appealing to the general public? Which model receives the highest rates of users?
Given the large size of the Dockless bike, and thanks for the question. This is a good one too. So given the large size of the Dockless bike sharing, then the user population is huge comparing with the users for docked bikes. These docked bikes in the Chinese context, where all these were introduced in the early stages, many of these docked bike sharing systems actually faced a decline of the number of users. Some of these just erased from the market even. They were not competitive enough to survive as compared with the Dockless bikes. So if we compare these to the dockless and docked bikes, then the dockless bikes seems attracted most of these users. But the situation is in general that there are also continuous users in the various other schemes. I think that basically comes back to the variety of the population and the user population in particular. They have different demands. Some have more regular patterns from point A to point B. Doesn't matter if you use a station or not. But others may be more random in using bikes. And still others may be more prefer to use their own bikes rather than to use a public bike. So all these demands, I think, reflect the needs of variety of these services, and that provide spaces for these services to continue operation in different places.
Okay. Now this is, I'm going to put two questions or two comments and questions together. The first one is, were those venture capitalists powerful enough to impact on government policies, especially in some of their smaller cities? And then another one that's related says, the existence of such OFO bikes has undoubtedly changed the planning of urban transport systems, just like more requirement of docks, which changed the urban plan and the roads. Could you please talk about what your thoughts about the dynamic transportation design and urban planning might be in the future to adapt to these changes in types and services of transport?
Yeah, that's great questions. Thanks for these questions. So I start from the second part of the question in terms of future transportation systems. The dockless bike sharing is part of these bicycles. It's just bicycle organized in different ways. And the bicycle has a place in organizing urban transportation, particularly to facilitate short distance travel. It's not for long distance travel. So when you talk about crossing cities or from one side of the big metropolitan area to another side, it's not bicycles. We still need all these mass transport modes. But within smaller distance, within a neighborhood, 20 minutes neighborhood, or we think about the last mile from the metro station to a home location, then that will be the places for using bicycles. So in the future transportation organization, I think bicycles, including these dockless bike sharing programs, will fit in to service a sector of the population. Now, the first part of the question, talking about the impact of these venture capitalists on the infrastructure or city decision making. Yes, we see that they have the power, and these power are particularly obvious when looking at smaller cities. One example I saw in the study is that some of these smaller cities were very keen to attract the bike sharing programs. The reason behind it is that they saw these programs as a symbol of modernization. Something happened in so many big cities. We wanted it to happen in our city, and then we try to get this. In that sort of situation, anyone, like the entrepreneurs who push up the bikes or the venture capitalists say, we need some particular infrastructure, like the parking facilities, or in terms of dedicated lanes, you got to provide this. It's very much likely that it will have an impact in terms of creation of these facilities.
There's again, I'm going to conjoin a couple of questions and a comment. It says, dockless bike systems have not been a success in most parts of the world, Singapore, parts of China, Melbourne. What about the idea of dockless electric scooters with a centralized tracking system to prevent vandalism by users? And the suggestion was that the centralized tracking system where the user's profile is monitored, perhaps linked to big data to be monitored by the police or the government. Are there any moves into this question, particularly in moving from bikes to also electric scooters as a way?
Good question. Thanks for that. The failure of the bikes, if we put it into a historical perspective, talking about the dockless bikes in Amsterdam, that's in 1965, and also those dockless bikes generated in Germany, That's in the early 21st century. We got DB over there, for example. We got Next Bike over there. That spread also in other European countries as well as the USA and also New Zealand. So dockless bike sharing is not only happening in China. But what surprised many people was the sheer size of this modern dockless bike sharing. Started from China, incorporating all this GPS stuff and spread all over to the places. And the contraction, what I talked about, were largely from this group of dockless bikes. So if we generalize, probably it's, we need to think basically very carefully about whether the overall dockless bike sharing has failed. It failed because of the expectations of these speculative expectations, I would say, particularly supported linked to the venture capitalists. So this is very much related, as in the question, with the vandalism of the bikes. And that part of the participants are very much those people which can be policed or can be educated somehow. It will take time, but basically these are the activities not generally accepted by the society and strictly is not lawful activities. And through various actions, I believe there is a way to deal with this, but it is true, it has been a problem in the operation of these dockless bikes. And this same thing may happen to the electric bikes, dockless also, or any other micro mobility devices. So I guess from the overall society and also the policing of the proper population behavior, it possibly can make a difference in the operations.
This is a question. It says, interesting presentation. Thank you, Sheng. I would like to know the motivations for the use of these bikes across the global north versus the global south. Is the issue of necessity a driving force because there are limited efficient means of traveling, for example, in the global south, while in the global north usage is more of a convenience or recreational purpose?
Thanks for this question. That's great. There is an attractive point of the dockless bike sharing, which is also highlighted when those entrepreneurs try to push up the spread of their bikes. That's the environmental friendly nature or the feature of that operation. So low carbon emission, good for health. You can exercise when you ride. This is something widely accepted by the global north population, environment, and health concerns. In the global south, yes, we see differences between the global south and global north. In developing countries, then bicycle basically provide a cheap transportation, and many people struggling to realize their motorization dream, but probably have difficulties in terms of the wealth situations. And this provide adequate mean as a replacement for their commuting needs. And these probably are the reasons supporting the dockless bike sharing programs.
I was wondering, just as a kind of extension of that, you had spoken about the example of the buses in I can't remember if it's in Kenya or Uganda. Ghana. And so I'm wondering if there are examples where, in a sense, the provision of the bikes by entrepreneurs or others is really a way of government not having to deliver something people might expect it to deliver, at least in terms of public transportation or systems. And there's a question here that asks, are there any notable examples of bike sharing systems implemented in cities that are lacking or with insufficient infrastructure, and including both in terms of the bikes, but also lacking of things like cycle lanes where, there's not a dedicated way to get around and such?
Yeah, great question. To my knowledge, it's selective still when they put the bikes into these cities. And bike infrastructure is one of the considerations. But in the global south, then there are limited dedicated bike infrastructure there. So it's still a situation that once you put in this new form of transport, there are more competitions on the road spaces. And come back to your early point, Don, about the government involvement, then it's very difficult not to have any government involvement in these schemes. And basically, when the bike comes to operation, then they operate in public infrastructure. The road spaces are there. And that's a very big part, very often involving public investment.
Great. Okay, I think we just have time for probably one more. So I'm going to ask this one. I'm sorry, there are other questions here we won't get a chance to answer, but it says, do you think shared bikes are doing more harm than good? Like previous slides, the industry caused many incidents of pollution and caused a lot of social problems. Do you think shared bikes still have a bright future, or will this idea be given up soon, like the Mobike or the Ofel bike?
Great question. Yes, I think the good thing brought by this Dockless bike sharing is the sort of entrepreneurship involved in urban mobility innovation, and without public input in the many terms, you got a new form of mobility, and that was invented very much invented in a sense that you put all these devices and modern technologies together, articulating these things and form a new way of using bicycles. And that sort of innovation came without much public funding or investment. That's one of the advantages of this program or the strengths of the program. But at the same time, we see up to now that the venture capitalist support of the program led to over-exaggerated growth of the programs, causing lots of environment concerns and the resource depletion concerns. And that's the part very speculative, and that's the part many governments realize that we don't want it, many societies realize we don't want it, and many users think that's something which is bad. And that thing in the process seems more and more, I mean that sort of oversupply or exaggerated growth becomes something recognized by the society, by many of the users. By recognizing that, there will be forces to stop that sort of things, but a smaller part of speculation continues in a way of that what sort of big data can generate and also benefit other businesses. That compared to the normal bike rental model is still different in a speculative nature. And I see that nature is still there and as a basic supporting point for the existing big operators to continue. Whether that speculative expectation can be realized or not very much determine the future of the shared bikes.
Great. Okay, thank you very much indeed. This has been fantastic and really a great set of questions that were coming through, a great deal of interest in both the topic, but also your presentation of it. So thank you very much, Professor. And we'll now just give a bit of an announcement on some future events that are coming up as part of MSD at Home. Our next event is, in fact, tomorrow evening, the 30th of September, Wednesday, the 30th of September, again, starting at 6 p.m., 1800 hours. We have MSD at Home with Anoma Perez. And this is really, she'll be in conversation with Paul Walker about her recently published book on sovereignty, space, and civil war in Sri Lanka. Please come and join us for that. It's effectively a book launch. We're not able to do a physical book launch, so this gives us a wonderful opportunity to both announce the launch of the book, but also a chance to have a bit of conversations and discussion around that. And following that event in the week after, on Wednesday, the 7th of October, at 4 p.m. At 1600 hours, we have a conversation about informality, the civic, and architecture in Indonesia. And this will be led by one of our academics, with Amanda Ahmedi from the Faculty of Architecture, Building, and Planning. So please join us again for that. And just a note in general, all of these lectures and talks are being recorded. And once they get edited and put into a final version, they become available on MSD at home on YouTube for the ABP UniMel. This is the link to that. So this event has been recorded and will eventually be uploaded once it's had a chance to be edited. So thank you to all of our audience for attending this evening, and we look forward to seeing you at the next event of MSD at Home. Thank you, Sheng.
Thank you.